how does Iran fit into the Ummah's struggle for dignity and independence? Whose interests does Iran actually serve? Today we're looking at Iran from a pneumatic lens, where we're going to answer these questions and more. Now, previously we talked about Iran's constitution, Article 11 and 12, and the pan-Islamic sentiment that is baked into the constitution. Now, this didn't happen in a vacuum. The fact that these things are in the constitution at this time of its writing, 1979, and then updated in the 80s, but there are reasons for the nature of this inclusion and the timing. And we have to go a little bit back into the post-colonial context to understand it. So you've got colonialism, and colonialism happens in two waves. You could say there's a pre-modern colonialism, that's your typical resource extraction. Modern colonialism, or something that I even call liberal colonialism, because this was the height of liberalism, philosophical liberalism, was more about social engineering. It was about the civilization mission. Yes, there was still resource extraction going on. Yes, there was still occupation of land and brutality. Yes, but it was really a larger, unprecedented, I would say, project to reconfigure entire societies, to change the way that they thought, to change the way that they felt about things, to change their laws, to change their culture, and of course to change Islam. And so in the second wave of colonialism, the modern or liberal era of colonialism, secularization becomes a tool for colonization. And this is why you've got many, many scholars writing against secularism. And you've also got many pan-Islamic movements, and you've also got Islamic revivalist movements, and they're not always the same. We also see the transition from empires to nation states. And when the Ottoman Caliphate is finally abolished in the early 1900s, this becomes a moment of crisis for the Ummah. Who is our leader now? Or what are we going to do? And are we just sitting ducks for Europeans carving up the world as the Muslim world was? You also have the influence of third world revolutions, especially coming out of World War II, and socialist internationalism. So many of the Muslim nations that are becoming independent, or at least formally independent after World War II, are looking to get their bearing, and they have various different ideological influences. Some of it is socialist, some of it is communist, some of it are just monarchies that are trying to preserve tribal cultures. Some of it is pan-Islamic. Some of them are trying to create a Islamic government. And I think that it's clear to see that Iran fits into that mold of the ones that are trying to articulate a pan-Islamic governance, or what does Islamic governance look like. Of course, it should also be said that the timing of the Iranian Revolution in the late 70s is also not an accident why it takes on a more Islamic flavor as opposed to a socialist one. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, and you can trace this within the Palestinian resistance factions as well, the main thrust of that movement was secular. It was secular and it was largely socialist. This is the height of the Ba'ath Party in Syria and Iraq and other places. That this is it's a tremendous force. And we're going to talk more about the Cold War and the Soviet influence on the Arab Muslim world and in the region in a second. But once you get to the 70s, you have, and especially the 80s, you have a different dynamic going on. You have people have woken up to the threat that secularism and socialism and communism pose to Islamic practice and Islamic governance. You've had the government of Egypt, for example, turning against the Muslim Brotherhood and persecuting the Muslim Brotherhood. You've got different types of regimes that are persecuting Islamic practice and political Islam specifically. And so that antagonistic force produces more Islamic movements. And you can again track that with the Palestinian resistance factions that are founded in the 70s and 80s. And then also with the other types of governments that come into power, or the movements and the uprisings that are happening. So you can situate Iran and the Iranian Revolution in 79, which we're going to get into the weeds and the details about that revolution a bit later. But you can really situate it in this wave of surging Islamic identity and surging Islamic activism and sentiment, of responding to the challenges of secularism and communism, responding to the dictatorial regimes and whether it's the monarchists or otherwise, and trying to forge a different way, trying to forge a way forth in which Islam can take on the technology of the nation state and make it its own. Of course, we've detailed in the previous episode how Halak's thesis laid out in The Impossible State says, well, that can't happen. And certainly it seems like there are significant challenges to doing that. But we can understand, I think, the Iranian Revolution as a similar flavor if it comes to the AK Party in Turkey or the Muslim Brotherhood or a Nahda in Tunisia. I know that people are going to bristle at those comparisons, but the basic premise that ties all those comparisons together is the idea that Islam should be in politics, and it should be in politics in a way that is fine with republican forms of government or democracy or in nation states in general. It's not inherently a contradiction, or it's not inherently in tension. But as we've said in the previous episode, nation states tend to instrumentalize religion. Whether you take Halak's side and say that necessarily always is going to be the case, or whether you say that sometimes is the case, I think that there's an argument to see if you trace the two major models of Islamic governance or Islamic representation at the nation state level throughout the post-World War II era. You're going to see two models emerge, one of which is Saudi Arabia, and the other of which is Iran after the revolution. So we're going to take a bit of a deep dive. It's somewhat of a detour, but it's going to prove our point here about what are the options that are available for people to get behind and to line up. How do the Muslims who are politically minded navigate the Cold War and trying to find their place within all of the tensions and alliances and allegiances that are going on? To what extent do each of these models, the Saudi model and the Iranian model, instrumentalize religion? And how does that play out when it comes to the Ummah's struggle to liberate itself? Let's go into Saudi Arabia. Of course, Saudi Arabia starts with the movement of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab in the 1700s. You see that, as we mentioned in a previous episode, when it comes to Shia groups, political revolution usually happens in a millenarianistic type of way. There's the hidden imam who's going to come back at the end of time, and he's got some type of representative that's here on earth that's going to tell people what to do, and now we have to be politically active and take power. Within Sunni Islam, it's very different. We don't have that type of hidden imam reality. And so when political revolution happens, it's often through takfir. It's often through disassociation or excommunication of Muslims. Now, let's be super clear about this. Takfir is something that is necessarily part of the deen because you have to have a border. You have to have a border between who isn't and who is not a Muslim. And similar to the principle of wala wal bara'a, of loyalty and disavowal, people will dismiss or they'll scapegoat takfir as like, what's wrong with Islam? It's like, oh, what's wrong with Islam? And takfir is responsible for terrorism. Not really. It's everybody does takfir. Like, you can't say I'm a Christian and I don't believe in Jesus and he never existed. That's just a contradiction. So it's just about everybody. Things have to mean something. A community has to have a boundary by which you can delineate who's in and who's out. That's just natural. What is concerning, just like with loyalty and disavowal, is not the thing itself, but how it's used, how it's weaponized. And so there's a right way to do takfir and there's a wrong way to do takfir. We don't want to get too much into the weeds of that. It's not the main point here. We're going to skip ahead to the third Saudi state. So the Ottomans and the Sauds are battling. Of course, Ahlul Saud, the House of Saud, are the political arm of the Ali Sheikh family, and they're what this sort of marriage between the Ahl Saud and Ahl Sheikh are the founding of the first Saudi state and the second Saudi state at war with the Ottomans. And then finally, the third Saudi state, which emerges with King Abdulaziz, officially declared to be the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. This is the one that lasts, right? This is the one that succeeds. So we're going to pick up the story there. King Abdulaziz rules from 1932 to 1953. Now, think about this. If you have an insurrectionist ideology, it's aimed at usurping, or usurping is a strong word, displacing or removing someone who is currently in power while you are currently out of power. What do you do once it flips? What do you do once you come into power? If you have an insurrectionist ideology, you got to put the lid on that thing. You've got to bring that thing under control, or else there's going to be constant chaos and bloodshed. And that is certainly what King Abdulaziz did. So his kind of most zealous troops are known as the Ikhwan. They're like, we're going to fight the British. We don't care if they've got planes. We don't care if they've got machine guns. We've got camels and swords, and we are going to fight the British. And they actually want to attack the British in Iraq. And King Abdulaziz actually has to wage war against his own people, against the Ikhwan, to stop them from doing that. So this is also, I think, when we talk about trajectories, right? You see very early on that both the house of Al Saud and Ali Sheikh, they represent two different trajectories within what are the possibilities? Where can this thing go? When it comes to the Ali Sheikh family, the original founders, the founding ideology of the movement, and then the Ikhwan, who they can be understood as the true believers in that mandate and call, this is a trajectory that leads to a lot of bloodshed. Now, that's not the only trajectory. It's not deterministic. There's other trajectories that are possible. So the Al Saud side of things, tempering the religious zeal or the Islamic zeal with now trying to articulate an ideology of governance, now converting it into ta'at al-wali al-amr, obeying the rulers and the leaders. This is something that creates a different trajectory. And that we could say, if ISIS is over here on one like far, far extreme of the spectrum of possibilities, then the other extreme is you have to obey the ruler no matter what. Even if he is going to collaborate with the non-Muslims to fight against other Muslims, and even if he's going to do this and do that, no matter what, you have to get in line. So, as we said, King Abdulaziz ruled from 1932 to 1953. He was succeeded by his son, King Saud, from 1953 to 1964. Now, here's where things pick up with the Cold War. So both King Abdulaziz and King Saud are very, very careful. And think about this. 53 starts in 53. This is after the Nakba in 47, 48. This is after Cold War is kicking off. King Abdulaziz and King Saud are very careful to stay neutral in the Cold War. So they actually joined the non-aligned movement. If you're familiar with the non-aligned movement, Saudi Arabia was present at the Bandung conference in Indonesia in 1955. They were big on Palestinian solidarity at that time, right? And they supported Arab states against Israel, and they financed their recovery from certain wars against Israel. When they had the opportunity to get closer to either the Americans or to the Soviets, they declined in general. So there was the Baghdad Pact. This was something that was done in 1955 to achieve kind of like a NATO in the Middle East. It was literally like a belt underneath the Soviet Union made up of Iran, Iraq, Pakistan, and Turkey. In addition to the UK, the US was involved. It was part of Eisenhower's containment strategy of trying to contain Sovietism. It totally failed, partly because the Soviet influence completely leapfrogged this belt of nations, and they became very influential in Syria and Jordan and South. Partly because Iraq would have a coup 3 years later in 58, and they would actually, here's the Ba'ath Party, and the Ba'ath Party is socialist. Partly because once you get to 74, Turkey invades Cyprus. Partly because Pakistan has their own issues with India, and when they're asking upon their friends in the Baghdad Pact to come and help them, the response from Eisenhower is like, this isn't really what that's about. Like, we're not here to help you with your problems. We're here to contain communism. So it falls apart, of course, especially with Iran leaving after the revolution of 79. The Baghdad Pact doesn't really come to fruition or do much of anything. King Saud also supported the Algerian Revolution against France. And actually, in fact, they donated money every single year from when the revolution started until independence. He also joined a joint defense agreement with Syria, Egypt, and Yemen in 1956. And they also supported Egypt in the Suez Canal crisis. If you didn't know about the Suez Canal crisis, you absolutely have to know about it. Very important history. Happened in 1956. Gamal Abdel Nasser comes to power in Egypt through that coup that we just mentioned, nationalizes the Suez Canal, and Israel tries to invade in order to take it over. They do so with the support of the UK and France, and they actually try to oust Gamal Abdel Nasser. King Saud, at the time, instituted an economic boycott on the UK and France in order to help the Egyptian effort. So no oil could go to Britain or France, and they broke out off diplomatic relations with them. Interestingly enough, and this is kind of like just a side point, the US and the Soviets both opposed the movements of Israel and the UK and France in the Suez crisis. Despite the fact that UK and France are their US's traditional allies, the US was much more concerned with the spread of communism. And they, in order to try to mitigate against that, they were trying to cozy up and develop these relationships with the newly independent leaders of the Muslim world and the quote-unquote third world globally. So Gamal Abdel Nasser and other people, they really didn't want people to flip communist. And so they were against. This is an interesting time where you have Soviets and the US against something that Israel did with the help of the UK and France. King Saud did meet with Eisenhower. He was the first king of Saudi Arabia to do so. And Eisenhower pitched to him his Eisenhower doctrine, which was basically, you guys are going to be anti-communists and help us out in exchange for arms and weapons and training. King Saud took shura with the other Arab nations, particularly Syria and the others that they were in the joint defense agreement with, and eventually declined. He actually said, thanks, but no thanks, Mr. Eisenhower. So you see that this is a very non-aligned movement politics. Again, very typical of these newly independent nations in the 50s and even the 60s. Now, King Saud was eventually forced to abdicate by Crown Prince Faisal and others. King Saud was seen as impious and wasteful, even corrupt. He incurred a lot of debt. He also eventually soured his relationship with Gamal Abdel Nasser. They were fighting a proxy war in Yemen, and King Saud and Saudi Arabia were supporting the monarchists, which were Zaydis, ironically, whereas the Gamal Abdel Nasser was supporting the Republicans and the socialists. So all of these factors and more, the perception was that King Saud is not really handling things as he should. And so King Faisal now comes to power in 1964, and he rules from 1964 until his assassination in 1975. Now, King Faisal is a legend. Of all the Saudi kings, he has the larger-than-life persona. Even his father, King Abdulaziz, said, quote, I only wish I had 3 Faisals, that he was deemed to be extremely competent, extremely wise. He was very pious, apparently, from how people describe his personal regimen and worship and austerity. He came right in with a 10-point program. He was responsible for modernizing, and not solely responsible. King Saud also did some things, but King Faisal was big on modernization, infrastructure, government, judiciary reforms. He was doing nation building. He was building connectivity, roads, power, water, education. However, that modernization under King Faisal's time was not necessarily westernization. And in fact, there's a really funny moment where Mohammad Reza, we'll talk about the Shah of Iran in a bit, he wrote a letter to King Faisal saying, if you don't let women wear miniskirts, then your kingdom might fall eventually. Basically, people are not going to tolerate that. And Faisal clapped back and said, listen, you're the Shah of Iran, not the Shah of France. And Iran, last time I checked, is a Muslim majority country. So even though there was tremendous modernization, it wasn't necessarily westernization. And King Faisal indeed was someone who had pan-Islamic credentials and himma and motivation. He was someone who was engaged in ummatic efforts. The difference was that when you get to the 70s, the biggest threat is now considered to be socialism and communism. So that both of those two things going together kind of help explain King Faisal's moves. So in order to contain communism, for example, King Faisal signed an agreement with Abdul Halim Mahmoud, the Egyptian Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, to combat communism in 1971. That was during the presidency of Anwar Sadat. And that agreement had money behind it. It was 40 million pounds to be sure. They were trying to stem secular socialist tendencies and influence among Saudis. That's also part of why King Faisal, even before he was king, was instrumental in establishing the Islamic University of Medina, my alma mater. Shout out to IUM. Also, they established the Muslim World League in 1962. That was an initiative that King Faisal wasn't king at that point, but he later became king, was part of. They imported scholars from a lot of different places, including Ikhwani scholars, right? So the tensions between the Ba'athist and socialist governments in the Arab world turning against Islamic movements such as the Ikhwan. The 60s and the 70s were a period of embracing and welcoming those elements within the country. Also, the OIC, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, was founded in 69. And you can see that King Faisal was very concerned with Ummadic affairs and affairs of the Ummah. Now, while that's true, it was also true that this pushed him closer to the United States than King Saud before him or King Abdulaziz, because again, what was seen as the primary threat was communism by this time. King Faisal was also legendary staunch supporter of Palestine. In a speech to the UN in 1947, long before he was king, he said, quote, "But today the Arabs wish to repel the aggression of a political minority group, namely the Zionists. It is a group which does not represent world Jewry. It is a group which is more political than religious, a group whose ways and methods are not different from those of the Nazis." That was 1947. One of Faisal's policies on the issue was to refuse recognition. So they did not recognize or normalize with Israel. And they attempted to unite Arab efforts to oppose Israel and leaving the differences aside in that. Saudi Arabia was regularly donating money for the fight, for war efforts, and to help nations recover that had fought in wars against Israel, and also attempting to establish bodies to help Palestinian representation. Now in 73, the very, very famous incident happens where there's the war with Israel, and then there's an oil embargo against the Western nations who supported Israel. So this is where King Faisal makes the famous statement about, we'll go back to dates and water if we have to. Like, come what may, we're going to support Palestine, and we are going to punish the Western nations that supported Israel. Unfortunately, King Faisal is assassinated in 1975, and he's replaced by his brother, King Khalid, who reigns from 1975 to 1982. At this point, again, communism is still seen as the bigger threat. Now, listen to some quotes from King Khalid, and I'll give you a window into this mentality. He said, quote, "We are against communism, and we will protect ourselves against it by all means. If the United States pressed Israel into making a just peace settlement, Russia would not acquire a single foothold in the Middle East." So he's trying to argue with the United States, trying to encourage them to check Israel, because that is what is enabling communist influence and their willingness to get involved with their internationalism. So Soviet, communism has a lot of internationalist sentiment. And in this period, the Soviets are way more willing to get involved in third world liberation struggles in general than the United States, who's kind of like still keeping things at arm's length, at least when it comes to this particular region. Another quote from King Khalid, he said, "We regard Zionism, communism, and colonialism as a trinity allied against Arab and Islamic rights and aspirations. Our policy is based on that understanding, and it is natural for us to be always subjected to biased and poisonous campaigns at the hand of that very trinity." So you see who's there and who's not there. Capitalism is not there. They don't clock capitalism as being a major threat at this point. Their main enemies, communism and Zionism and colonialism, which explains a lot of their foreign policy and a lot of their moves. We're going to see where this ends up leading to. That being said, there was still an attempt to maintain non-alignment for the time being, especially when tensions flared between the US and the Soviets. So for example, 1981, at the very end of King Khalid's reign, there's the third summit of the OIC in Ta'if, and he says, quote, "Our loyalty must be neither to an Eastern Bloc nor a Western Bloc. The security of the Islamic nation will not be assured by joining a military alliance, nor by taking refuge under the umbrella of a superpower." Oh, how things will change. Oh, how things will change. And here's what changes. The first thing being the Iranian Revolution of 1979. Okay, so King Khalid initially sends Khomeini a congratulatory message. And he states in that message, hey, we're bros. Islamic solidarity is possible. We could become closer. And he actually even instructed the OIC to also congratulate the new Iranian government. But 2 or 3 key events would be responsible for an about-face on this. One is the Grand Mosque seizure by Juhayman al-Utaybi and his 600 militants, also called the Ikhwan, not to be confused with King Abdulaziz's Ikhwan or the Muslim Brothers, Ikhwan al-Muslimin. So they besiege the mosque, they occupy it. And I think with the Grand Mosque seizure of 1979, the reality of political revolution kind of hit home. for the Saudi monarchy. And they become much more concerned from 1979 onward in preserving their rule. That is going to drive them closer to U.S. foreign policy interests and their defense apparatus, as we will see. The second major thing is the Iran-Iraq War of the 80s. From 1980 to 1988, there is a really bloody war that the U.S. plays both sides and funds both sides in order to degrade both. It is read in a sectarian way, unfortunately. Even though Saddam Hussein, who's the leader of Iraq at the time, is a Ba'athist, he's a secularist, he is technically a Sunni Muslim. And so it becomes read as Sunnis versus Shias. And that was something that Saudi Arabia supported Iraq in that particular conflict. And then King Khalid dies in 1982, and that makes way for King Fahd. And King Fahd will precipitate a lot of these changes. So from 1982 to 2005, King Fahd fully threw his weight behind Iraq against Iran. He was close now with other dictators in the region, Hosni Mubarak of Egypt, Hafiz al-Assad of Syria. They did support the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and Bosnia, but the last kind of chip to fall, if you will, or domino to fall, would be the first Gulf War. So Saddam Hussein invades Kuwait, and all of a sudden, there they are on the border of Saudi Arabia. Nobody knows what are his aspirations here. It is experienced by Saudi Arabia as an existential threat, and there becomes a very controversial question. Do we ask outsiders for help? Do we accept or try to gather military assistance from Western powers? And this is something that actually even splits the ulama. But the government goes with yes. We're going to request the Americans to come. The U.S. Army comes to defeat Iraq in the first Gulf War, maintain bases there, station troops there. And this unlocks a dramatic increase of U.S. military presence in the region. It's also the beginning of Osama bin Laden's villain arc, right? If you know anything about his letters to America, he's radicalized by this, and Al-Qaeda is a consequence of these decisions. One of their main criticisms was the Saudi Arabian government's decision to get closer to the United States and to use the United States against Iraq. Now, King Fahd was very concerned about his Islamic credentials, and that's why he's the first to actually assume the title of the custodian of the two holy mosques. It still is the title, one of the titles of the King of Saudi Arabia. That wasn't done until King Fahd in 1986. So we see that in response to Iran, and Iran putting itself forth as we are the Islamic revolutionary movement, vanguard, whatever, this now divergence and Saudi Arabia positing itself as the soft power, as this is an alternative model for representing the Ummah and for gaining legitimacy. The expansion of the Haram in Mecca is not accidental. It's the facilitation of worship, but it's also the increase of soft power. In 1955, less than 50,000 people could pray in the Masjid al-Haram. Now it's 1.85 million, right? And that expansion has been very, very rapid. After King Fahd, you've got King Abdullah from 2005 to 2015. Then, of course, 2015 to the present, you've got King Salman, who's really kind of running the show as MBS, his son, Mohammed bin Salman. And these three kings you see moving closer to the U.S. and its security apparatus in terms of trying to coup-proof their own government. You see that there are several limits to how ummatically Saudi Arabia has been able to act. Its own self-preservation, its own rivalry with Iran has been the cause of it undermining certain Islamic movements at home and abroad. And now we have to turn to the other example, which is Iran, and see, despite being rivals, despite having a very, very different origin story, are similar dynamics at play. Do the best intentions of ummatic solidarity and pan-Islamic support eventually become subsumed and subverted to just nation-state interests? Short answer, probably yes. But in order to get to Iran, we've got to go back. So we'll start with the Qajars. The Qajars were the ruling empire or dynasty from 1789 to 1925. That is the period of late colonialism, modern liberal colonialism. And so the Qajars, a lot of suffering happened to Iranian independence and interests, or I guess we should say Persian at this point, in history under the Qajars. They were caught in between the Russians and the Brits, who were dominating the economic and political interests. They go to war with the Russians 1804 to 1813, and again in 1826. They're in war with the British in 1856, and they're just depleted. They're completely incapacitated by all of these wars, and Russia and the UK sparring for control of this resource-rich land. And so after this last war with the British, you see concessions. Foreign powers are now exporting and extracting minerals from Iran. You've got the tobacco concession of 1890. You've got the oil concession of 1901. People under the Qajars were not benefiting from these concessions. It was a method of neocolonialism, informal colonialism, colonialism by extraction. That precipitated the constitutional revolution of 1905 to 1911. The ulama and other reformers, they were like, listen, this is out of control. We don't have any sovereignty. We're dominated by foreign interests. And they attempted to rein in the ability of the rulers to give away these concessions. In 1921, Reza Khan overthrew the Qajars. So this is the beginning of the Pahlavi Dynasty, which officially begins in 1925. Now, the Pahlavis were different from the Qajars in one way, and they were similar in another way. They were different in that they had very ambitious modernization plans. They were like looking across the world. It's 1925. The reason that we're behind and we're dominated is because we're not advanced enough. We're not technologically advanced enough. We're not modern enough. The problem was, how are you going to bankroll that? It ended up in the same patterns of foreign dependence in order to develop those industries with no plan for autonomy. And so we see a lot of changes, but we see a lot of inequality. Those changes are not being allocated in equitable ways across society. World War II happens in a kind of very symbolic fashion. Both the UK and the Soviets invade Iran. They actually remove the father, Reza Khan Pahlavi, and they install his son, Mohammad Reza Khan. They think that Mohammed is going to be more amenable to their interests. This galvanized a nationalist movement. And again, this is after World War II. Nations are becoming independent, at least formally. And so there is an Iranian nationalist movement. In 1949, it's led by Mohammad Mossadegh, or Mossadegh, depending on how you want to pronounce that. He took the lead of the National Front, and they had very, very clear common goals. The common goal was to nationalize the oil industry, very smart, and to reduce foreign influence. In 1951, Mossadegh's party wins a plurality in the elections, and therefore he becomes the prime minister. The oil industry gets nationalized, and Britain, of course, responds by freaking out, and they impose an economic blockade on Iran. The Shah, Mohammad Reza, attempts to dissolve parliament and dismiss the prime minister Mossadegh, but people and the military even rally behind Mossadegh, and the Shah is on the outside looking in. Mossadegh then tries to maneuver to impose limits through law of the Shah's ability to rule. And that is what triggers Operation Ajax. This is under Eisenhower, where the CIA imposed a coup on Iran, and they took out Mossadegh from power, and they reinstated Mohammad Reza, the Shah. Now, they hoped that the Shah would be their guy against communism. That's why it fit in with Eisenhower's plan. 1960s are known as the period of the White Revolution. Now, this is, if you've ever seen these really super cringe photos and videos of like, oh, look at how progressive Iran used to be before the crazy Muslims took over. Here's the women in short skirts, and here's, people looking like Westerners. That was all because of forced secularization under an oppressive tyrannical regime, the Shah in the 60s. So the White Revolution saw rapid secularization, modernization. This is the time where the scholars start to speak out, and one scholar named by Ruhollah Khomeini becomes very, very prominent in his opposition. There's a famous story of someone trying, I think, to remove the hijab from an Iranian woman, and Khomeini actually goes up and slaps him in the face. And there's lore, Khomeini has lore when it comes to the 60s and opposing the secularization and being an outspoken critic of what was going on. Now, this results in his exile. He's exiled from Iran in 1964, and he eventually is waiting out in France. But he's still getting media messages into the country, and his sermons become extremely popular, and his writings become extremely popular as well. This is the era of extreme political repression. SAVAK, S-A-V-A-K, the intelligence agency controlled by the Shah, brutal practices against their own population. This eventually culminates in revolutionary fervor in September 8th of 1978, what's known as Black Friday in Iran. The Jaleh Square in Tehran, hundreds of protesters were killed by the government forces. This galvanized opposition. Now, the people who were opposed to the Shah, it was a large and diverse movement that was against the Shah. If it was like liberals and communists, socialists, Islamic clerics, merchants, like it was a very, very cosmopolitan group. Despite the diversity, there is a clear call for Khomeini to come back and take the lead. There's calls for Islamic rule, and nobody really seems to have a problem with that. January 16th, 1979, the Shah flees. February 1st, Khomeini returns. He's greeted like a hero. Reports saying that millions are there to greet him. And Iran is declared an Islamic Republic by referendum in April 1st of 1979. But so then what happened? So we were talking about the fundamental tension is between the pan-Islamic elements that are baked in the Constitution and the times versus the sectarian content that is there in 12er Shi'ism that's always potentially lurking to be redeployed, and then also secular nationalistic interests and aspirations. So where does Iran go from its 1979 revolution, and how did that contribute to where it is today? We see the Iran-Iraq War, as we mentioned, from 1980 to 1988, was a major factor in the sectarianization of the government. It was fought despite, again, Saddam Hussein being a Ba'athist, being technically a socialist, secularist. He was technically, ethnically a Sunni. And so the conflict is read as Sunnis versus Shias. A lot of the discourse deployed within Iran to galvanize support and to marshal support is of a sectarian nature, and it kind of takes Iran further down that track. Of course, Saudi Arabia and other nations jumping in on the side of Iraq was also something that furthered this perception that this is a Sunni versus Shia thing. This culminated after Iran deliberately adopted a strategy called the Shia Crescent. And we're going to get into some of the particulars about this, that fighting and empowering sectarian actors in a belt that stretches from Iran to the Mediterranean, going through Iraq and Syria and Lebanon. That is one of the main things that has eroded Iran's pan-Islamic and Ummadic credibility. So Iran started backing Hezbollah in Lebanon, who are also 12er Shia, and also very deeply sectarian in Lebanon in the 80s. They've also backed the Houthis. Of course, the Houthis have a little bit more of a complex relationship with Iran because the Houthis are fivers, they are Zaydis, they're not quite the same. And as we mentioned, that they were actually supported by King Faisal and some of the Saudi kings against the socialists or the Republicans. Anyway, one could argue that the driving force behind this strategy wasn't purely sectarian, since Iran supported the Houthis and Iran supports Hamas, and Hamas are Sunnis. It's not a perfect fit. But it's also true that when we look at the actions in Iraq and Syria after 9/11, there's definitely an undeniable sectarian bend to them that is very regrettable, that becomes the hard ceiling and the limitation of their pan-Islamic commitments and action. Following the U.S. invasion of Iraq in 2003, Iraq was destroyed. I mean, it's hard to overemphasize the way in which the infrastructure, the armed forces, the intelligence community, everything was disbanded. The policy was called de-Baathification. So it was similar to denazification, that 500,000 people became unemployed overnight that were part of the military or otherwise tied in with the government. And so this presented a golden opportunity to Iran to restructure Iraq in a way that was favorable to Iran. And that's exactly what happened. So de-Baathification in and of itself, because unlike in Syria, the Baathists in Iraq were usually Sunnis. So de-Baathification became associated with anti-Sunnism. or anti-Sunni sectarianism, because it did happen to affect Sunni Muslims disproportionately. But then in the reconstruction of Iraq after 2003, Iran rebuilt the nation politically, religiously, militarily, in order to create a pro-Iranian Shia-led client state. If you want to go into the particulars, the Badr organization, which fought alongside Iran during the Iran-Iraq war, was seen as an asset by the US in the fight against the Ba'athist partisans because they opposed Saddam. So after the fall of Baghdad, the Badr forces and other militias with close ties to Iran, they joined the newly reconstituted army, police, and the interior ministry in significant numbers. Many Badr members became part of the Interior Ministry-run Wolf Brigade, and the Iraqi Interior Minister, Bayan Jabr, was a former leader of the Badr Brigade militia. You also look to the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq and other parties that also had military wings. They all had close ties with Iran. Of course, Iran was most famous for its militias within Iraq. So you have their trained Shiite militias, Kata'ib Hezbollah, not to be confused with Lebanese Hezbollah. You've got Asa'ib al-Haq, you've got the Mahdi army. They were attacking US forces, and they were also attacking Sunni Muslims, and they were widely accused of promoting sectarian violence, perpetrating ethnic cleansing, displacement of Iraqi Sunnis, carrying out war crimes, including abductions, forced disappearances, massacres, extrajudicial killings, and they even destroyed entire villages in the Anbar region, the Salahuddin region, Diyala region, as well as conducting anti-Sunni campaigns that have been described as genocidal. Many were formally incorporated into the government forces known as the PMF, the Popular Mobilization Forces, the Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, which are notorious, that became formed in 2014 and onward in response to the rise of ISIS. So the Hashd al-Sha'bi is 67 primarily Shia armed factions, almost all of which are not only Iranian backed, but like on their own websites, like declare allegiance to Iran and the grand leader, the supreme leader of Iran. So they're not even like trying to hide it. Now, the rise of ISIS becomes extremely important to sectarianization and furthering some of the dynamics that we've already seen. So, you know, I didn't have it on my bingo card, but here we are. Let's give a brief history of ISIS. ISIS, Daesh, whatever you want to call them, did not rise out of a vacuum. They represent the consolidation of a lot of the Sunni insurgent groups that were active in Iraq post-invasion. So if you want to break down the post-US invasion scene in Iraq into periods, you could say from 2003 to 2006, there's kind of like initial insurgency. You've got really strange bedfellows on the non-Shia side. So you've got ex-Baathists on one end to like Fadayin, Faisal, and you've got like Jamaat al-Tawheed wal-Jihad and like Al-Qaeda and like different groups like that, like really, really strange groups that you wouldn't necessarily would think would be on the same side, end up being on the same side in Iraq, launching their insurgency against American forces. Of course, it evolves into a civil war from 2006 to 2008. That's where you see consolidation along certain lines. There's something called the Mujahideen Shura Council in Iraq. They rebrand, or actually they're made up of AQI, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Jamaat Jaish Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, Jaish Ta'if al-Mansura, and they rebrand within the same year in 2006 as Islamic State of Iraq. And to be clear, they are not the only representation of Sunni opposition to the American army. There's the Political Council for the Iraqi Resistance, and there's others. But of course, ISIS would become the most famous. And even George Bush at the time, before ISIS rose, was very intentional to single out Al-Qaeda in Iraq as like the villain and the bad guy, to give you a sense of like, to make it clean, to make a clear villain, right? That would contribute also to the sectarian nature of things, Sunnis being read and assumed to be supporters of Al-Qaeda or Daesh and assumed to be terrorists. We'll see that in just a second. By the time you get to 2011, that's when the U.S. withdraws troops and they hand over sovereignty supposedly to Iraqi forces. That's when the insurgency picks up again after a brief lull. You've got the revival of ISI, the Islamic State of Iraq, and they expand into Syria. More on that in a bit when we talk about Iran's activity in Syria. And from 2014 to 2017, we're back to full civil war. That's the rebrand as ISIS, as Daesh. And there's a dramatic escalation and a dramatic and very rapid territorial gain that ISIS makes. Now, if you've ever wondered, how is ISIS able to take over so much land so quickly? The reason was because of the resentment to Shia sectarian militias and anti-Sunni genocide, you could say, certainly ethnic cleansing, that was going on. It was a huge factor that in one quote, one Iraqi politician said to the BBC, quote, "The Sunnis are getting to the point where they think that the Islamic State is a lesser evil than the Shia militias." Pretty wild, but also true. Ironically, this gave the government even more of an excuse to rely on Shia militias to target Sunni insurgents, because now it's us against the terrorists, right? And that was something that, became a green light for a lot of Shia sectarian violence in Iraq and beyond. So again, strange bedfellows. This created a scenario where the US and Iran and Iran's proxies in Iraq were actually all had the same enemy, and that was ISIS. But it also contributed to the further sectarianization of Iraq. If you were a Sunni Arab in Iraq, if you're Kurd, it's kind of a different story. But if you were a Sunni Arab in post-war Iraq, you couldn't catch a break. Either you were assumed to be a pro-Ba'athist, or later on you were assumed to be pro-ISIS. And so the playbook that the Shia militias would follow is that they would liberate an area from ISIS control with oftentimes support, air support from the United States and intelligence support from the United States. And then they would clear the Sunni population from the area under the pretense that they were all ISIS supporters. And then they would raise their homes and destroy stuff so that they wouldn't let anybody come back. This happened in Jurf al-Sakhr, it happened in Mosul, it happened in Tikrit, it happened in other areas of Iraq, and it's well documented. So just putting the bow on the involvement in Iraq, Iranian-backed militias also played a key role in using lethal force to quell the Tishreen movement in 2019. So when you get to 2019, Iraqis are tired, Sunni Iraqis are tired of all the meddling from Shia militias and being oppressed in their own land. Anti-Iranian sentiment was behind it. The protests resulted in the resignation of Prime Minister Abdul Mahdi and his government. In their place was appointed Mustafa al-Kadhimi, and the U.S. Embassy is attacked. So towards the very end. Now you would think, okay, there's a protest, there's an uprising, it's attacked by the Sunnis. No, actually it was attacked by the PMF, by the Hashd al-Sha'bi, the mobilization forces, on the last day of 2019. Now think about this, listen to this. The attack is organized by Iran's proxy leaders, including Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. U.S. President at the time, Donald Trump, accuses Iran of orchestrating the attack, and he blames two people in particular, Major General Qasem Soleimani of the Iran Quds Force, and then this gentleman I just mentioned, Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis. And so each of those were assassinated in short order near the Baghdad International Airport on the 5th of January. Or I should say, no, on the 5th of January, the Iraqi parliament called for the expulsion of U.S. troops from the country. So that's the final removal of U.S. troops from the country. Iraq starts to call for it in response to the drone attack assassination, which is in response to the PMF attacking the U.S. embassy. So the legacy of Iran in Iraq, I hope everybody is super clear. It's not pretty and it's not good. Certainly not pan-Islamic. That Iran directly and indirectly contributed to a full-blown sectarian conflict, ethnic cleansing, one could say genocide, against Sunnis in Iraq. That should not be forgotten and should not be glossed over. And just our Iraqi brothers and sisters' rights that they not be forgotten and what they experienced there. Are you ready for more? Because there's more. Let's go to Syria. So Syria, the dynamics are a little bit different because the Assads who are in charge are not Sunnis, they're Nusayris. Nusayris is a sect that's deemed as non-Muslim by both the Sunni and the Shia. Okay, so they're not recognized as Muslim by either. Year 2000, Bashar al-Assad comes to power, replaces his father, moves the country more towards a crony capitalism that erodes a lot of the economic prosperity that people in Syria were feeling. Inequality becomes a regular thing. 2011, of course, the uprising begins. So due to the frustrations that are happening and then inspired by the Arab Spring, March 15th is the beginning of the uprising in Syria. Peaceful protests in Daraa and demanding democratic reforms, the release of political prisoners. April through July, the protests go nationwide. The regime responds with crackdowns and leading to escalating unrest. 2012 to 2013, it becomes a civil war. Okay, so if you go to 2012 in January, the group Jabhat al-Nusra is announced. That's an offshoot of Al-Qaeda. It's based in Idlib and Halab and Aleppo, and it becomes the most effective base. It's led by someone who is now the leader of Syria, Ahmed al-Shara. In July of 2012, the Free Syrian Army is formed from defected military officers. So again, this is now full-on armed conflict, civil war. 2013, rebel forces capture key cities, Raqqa, parts of Aleppo, and the regime starts to receive support from Iran and Hezbollah. I've got a separate timeline for that. April 2013, Jabhat al-Nusra under Ahmed al-Shara, who was then known as Abu Muhammad al-Julani, he refuses a forced merger. And this is a kind of a funny thing where Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, famous, right? Died like a dog. He's the leader of ISIS in Iraq. He announces a forced merger between him and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria, and the rest of Al-Qaeda and Jabhat al-Nusra are like, what? No, actually we're not doing that. And even to the point where Al-Qaeda leaders speak out against it. So al-Nusra refuses. They say, nope, we're going our own separate way. You know, ISIS was even too radical for Al-Qaeda, and that's really saying something. And that is the formal split between ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, and then, of course, things continue to change from there. 2014 to 2017, recall, is the rise of ISIS and foreign interventions. 2014, ISIS seizes large territories in Syria and Iraq. That prompts US-led coalition airstrikes and support for Kurdish forces. 2015, Russia gets involved and intervenes militarily in the support of the Assad regime, changing the dynamics of the fight. By 2017, ISIS loses most of its major strongholds, but they still continue to pose a threat in certain areas. Real quick timeline of Iran's involvement in Syria. Now, their involvement is quite early. It doesn't actually come. They will use ISIS as an excuse for their involvement, but their involvement goes back to 2011 and 2012. So as protests start in 2011, Iran is providing financial aid to Assad, riot control gear, intelligence support. 2012, Iran begins deploying the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps advisors led by Quds Force Commander Qasem Soleimani, who's not yet assassinated. He'd be assassinated 8 years later, to help restructure Assad's forces, just the way that they restructured Iraq's forces. You see the playbook here. Hezbollah starts to secretly send fighters across the border. Initially, they deny involvement. In 2013, that's when you get the public involvement, the admission of involvement from Hezbollah and escalation. And that happens during May of 2013 with the Battle of Qusair. So Hezbollah publicly acknowledges its role. It sends thousands of fighters to help Assad retake Qusair near the Lebanese border. This is seen as a turning point that basically saves the regime. So you've got the Iranian-backed Shia militias that are saving the brutal Assad regime from falling. Not very pan-Islamic. 2013 onward, Iran expands the recruitment of foreign Shia militias from Afghanistan, from Pakistan, from Iraq. Under the IRGC umbrella, they form the Shia Liberation Army. So again, a needless sectarianization of whatever their political goals are. And at this point, we're all pre-ISIS at this point, even though there's still proto-ISIS elements, Islamic State of Iraq and other things that are going on in Iraq. ISIS doesn't really come into the picture until the next year. So in this period from 2014 to 2016, you've got the institutionalization of support. ISIS comes on the scene formally in 2014. Now that gives Hezbollah and Iran all the justification they're looking for. Now their presence in Syria can be easily defended. We're fighting terrorists. And it's actually an irony that a nation that has used the language of America is the great Satan to the end of it adopts completely uncritically the language of terrorism and the global war on terror in order to justify its presence and its actions and activities in Syria. 2015, Russia enters the war. In September, Hezbollah and Iranian forces coordinate closely with Russia in major offensives. 2016, there are joint Iranian Hezbollah Syrian operations to retake Aleppo, and a decisive battle in which Hezbollah loses hundreds of fighters. For the period from 2017 to 2019 is a period of consolidation. Hezbollah entrenches itself along the border with Lebanon, particularly in Qalamun. 2018, they recapture Ghouta and southern Syria. 2018-2019, Israel is making now airstrikes on Iranian and Hezbollah targets in Syria. They are concerned about permanent installations and entrenchment and weapons transfers going on. After Qasem Soleimani is assassinated in 2020, we've got a couple other developments. Iran continues to entrench influence throughout local militias, cultural centers, economic projects. Hezbollah had a permanent presence. Many people have remarked that this is how they were infiltrated by Israeli Mossad during this period. And Israel continued to make strikes against Iranian assets in the region. Now, Iran and Hezbollah are framing their role as part of the axis of resistance against Israel and the US. This is, of course, until the revolution in December 2024, Assad and the Iranian presence completely collapses. So in sectarian terms, you see how it doesn't fit, but it does fit. Like the Nusayris are not considered Muslim by 12er Shia. So it's not necessarily sectarianly motivated or sectarian sentiment that's bringing them together in solidarity. That being said, certainly their actions, Iran's actions within Syria, were certainly sectarian. They used sectarian language, Shia Liberation Army, not an Islamic Liberation Army, and their nationalist goals. So I guess you could put on one hand their sectarian activity, their sectarian goals, and their nationalist goals. They came and were met. The Shia Crescent were achieved at the expense of its pan-Islamic goals. And this is something that is a limit on people's how they feel about Iran and their solidarity with Iran to this day. Khamenei insisted on keeping Bashar, even though he knew full well Bashar al-Assad's horrendous record in Syria. He was using chemical weapons, mass torture, the whole 9 yards. So we see that this is a mix of nationalist and sectarian aims. Claiming that this is just axis of resistance strategy doesn't really hold up. In 2016, there was a scholar by the name of Hussein Ibrahim Qutrib who wrote an article about the demographic changes that happened in Syria from 2011 to 2016. And he's particularly focusing on the 6 governorates of Damascus, Rif Dimishq, Homs, Hama, Latakia, and Tartus, the most populated regions. So within these regions, pay attention to these numbers. Qutrib pointed out that all told, these six governorates contained 46% of Syria's total population in 2011, 9.8 million people out of the Syrian population of about 21.4 million at the time. The demographic breakdown in 2011 was around 69% Sunni, 21% Alawite, 1% Shia, 1% Druze, 2% Ismaili, and 6% Christian. By the time 2016 rolls around, the population fell in this area from 9.8 million to 7.6 million. So we have general depopulation. Who's being depopulated? We get into the demographics. The same 6 areas are now from 69% to 52% Sunni, from 21% Alawite to 24% Alawite, from 1% Shia to 14% Shia. 1% Druze, 3% Ismaili, and 7% Christian. The main change being the explosive growth of Shia and the dramatic reduction of Sunni population. If you focus on a couple of the governorates in particular, Rif Dimishq and Homs, the numbers are even more dramatic. Rif Dimishq went from 87% Sunni in 2011 to 54% Sunni in 2016. Homs went from 64% Sunni in 2011 to 21% Sunni in 2016. That demographic transformation is, Qutrib described it as Shiaization. It is definitely ethnic cleansing. It's very similar to the playbook that Iran used in Iraq. So let's zoom out. We've covered a lot. Iran benefited the most from ISIS's presence. They used the existence of ISIS as a cover to establish its strategy of the Shia Crescent, the depopulation of Sunni areas and the replacement of Sunni populations with Shia populations, even if the pretext is to create a corridor of weapons and whatever across the region to the Mediterranean Sea and to link up with Hezbollah. But no axis of resistance or anti-imperialist argument can justify this type of sectarian violence or ethnic cleansing that took place. And in order to accomplish it, to add insult to injury, Iranian politicians and military leaders, they employed the same post-9/11 discourse of the quote-unquote great Satan that they were supposedly against. The US, they happily weaponized it upon other Muslims. They were fighting terrorists supposedly the whole time. And it's only because the governments in the Sunni majority countries were so weak and doing the bidding of the Western superpowers that people would even think to make excuses for Iran's actions in the first place. Now, this doesn't mean that we overlook any of the good that Iran has done, of course, and sometimes when they've stood up against Israel and they've stood up against and they've supported Palestinian movements, that we don't want to necessarily overlook that. But at the same time, we can't turn a blind eye or give a free pass to the horrible wrongs that they've committed. I think the common thread throughout the series is that when they're right, and when they're wrong, they're wrong. And the same goes for us. When we're right, and when we're wrong, and we need to be frank about that. But these actions and the behavior of Iran in Iraq and Syria highlight the fundamental tension within the Iranian government and even in the constitution between its pan-Islamic aspirations, its sectarian aspirations, and its secular nationalist aspirations. Now, one of the troubles of nation states, as we said in the previous episode, is it provides an endless justification for immoral behavior and policies. Anything can be done under the rubric of security interests or anti-imperialist strategy in this case. And the sectarian content of Twelver Shi'ism, it likely forms a limit on Iran's ability to make good on its stated pan-Islamic goals. This was only exacerbated by how history unfolded with the Iran-Iraq War in the 80s. So what's the verdict? How does Iran fit into the Ummah's struggle for dignity and independence? I would quote Gayatri Spivak here, using a turn of phrase, that Iran is both indispensable and inadequate to Ummadic history and Ummadic struggle. They're indispensable in the sense that the revolution was against Western-backed dictators. They stopped forced secularization and cultural imperialism, and that is something that is quite remarkable and that we can applaud. But it's inadequate in the sense that the failures of their pan-Islamic hopes and aspirations, the failure to articulate a vision of the future or a vision of Islamic governance that promotes flourishing for everybody, not just for their own preferred sect. That's a major limitation and failure of the Iranian government, the Iranian project. And that's why we can't settle for less. That when it comes to thinking about where we're at in the Ummah today, we want to move forward and we want to move better. We want to be able to articulate, yes, to stand up to the forces of evil, to Western encroachment, to imperialism, to apartheid state of Israel, and to the occupation of Palestine. But we also want to be able to articulate a vision for everyone. We also want to be able to establish Islamic governance or hope to contribute to an Islamic project that is going to be able to be just and equitable for everybody. Now, next time we're going to, in the final installment of this series, we're going to look at Iran from a geopolitical lens and touch on some of the current events that are happening today. So we'll see you then.